Accessible Player Experiences, Designing for All Players with Stephen Weitz. AliCamp 2022. AliCamp would like to thank our gold sponsors Intopia, Salesforce and Telstra, and silver sponsors ANZ, Deloitte Digital and Coles.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining my presentation. Today I want to talk to you about accessible player experiences and introduce you to an approach that AbleGamers has created, which allows game developers to design accessible experiences into their games, helping to ensure all players can have the experiences they want or need in a game without substantially impacting development time or compromising a game's creative vision. To start, I'm going to do the obligatory "this is who I am" slide, just so you don't have to wonder too much about why you're listening to me. So I'm Steve Weitz. I'm the Director of Professional Development at the AbleGamers charity. And I've had a bit of a varied background that has led me to where I am. So I have about 20 plus years of experience in visual art, animation, and game design. I've worked on animation and visual effects for TV, films, and games. And I've also been a college professor teaching both digital arts and game design for about 15 years. Now, throughout all of this, my focus has been on how media in general can be used for the betterment of society, which leads me pretty perfectly into my role at AbleGamers. And yeah, I do still enjoy pretentious yet somehow still silly art, as you can see here with the self-portrait I included on this slide. Now, enough about me though, let's talk about AbleGamers. So AbleGamers' mission is to enable play in order to combat social isolation, foster inclusive communities, and improve the quality of life for people with disabilities. Now, the work we do towards this mission is on many fronts, working one-on-one with players who have disabilities, doing advocacy and community outreach, to educating and assisting with game developers. That's actually a big part of my role. And all of this work is important because ultimately gaming is important. Now, a lot of people think that gaming is just entertainment, and entertainment can be important in its own right. But I really want to stress and strongly make the point that gaming does have the power to change lives. Now, to drive that point home, I really want to focus on the social isolation aspect of our mission. Now, the concept of social isolation has really been brought into sharp focus for all of us over the last few years with the COVID-19 pandemic. It's important to recognize, though, that for many, many years, people with disabilities have been socially isolated. As a matter of fact, the last few years really have been no different than it was before the pandemic. And we've all experienced the effects of social isolation firsthand. They can be real and potentially devastating. But once again, it is important to note that this is not just devastating. It can actually be life-threatening. There have been a lot of studies done that show that mortality rates are higher for those with high degrees of social isolation. So one study actually showed that mortality rates are 12% higher with those that are socially isolated from those who are not. And it's really important to note that people with disabilities often face a larger degree of social isolation. So, about 51% of people with disabilities are socially isolated, compared to just 15.5% of those who do not identify with having a disability. So when we talk about the importance of using games as a means of combating social isolation, the stakes are very real and very high. And one of the many ways that games can help reduce social isolation is by allowing people to make friends and form social connections, even if they are otherwise socially isolated. Now, this might seem like an odd picture choice for social connections, but it's actually quite fitting. So let me tell you a story that might drive this home a little bit more. Now, as you likely know, AbleGamers talks to many people with all kinds of disabilities. This particular story comes from a woman who is profoundly disabled. And when I say profoundly disabled, what I mean is that her disability is both outwardly very visible and it greatly impacts her life. She's confined to a wheelchair and requires help breathing with the use of a ventilator machine, which obviously she has on her at all times. Now, her story takes place when she was in middle school in the mid-2000s or so. In between classes, when students would move from room to room, she was kept behind so that she could more easily move through the hallways to get her to her next class. Basically because the school administration felt that empty hallways would be easier to navigate for someone in a wheelchair. Now, this had the unfortunate effect of dramatically limiting her ability to socialize with her classmates. And to make matters worse, because of this delayed hallway travel and other limited accommodations, she would always be the last in class and end up at the back of the class, further isolating her from everyone else. And on top of that, as we all know, middle school kids are not always the most kind and certainly not the most open-minded. So the fact that there was a profoundly disabled girl in their class was causing them to keep their distance anyway. So not a good situation all around. Well, one day, as students were gathering their things and lining up to leave class, this girl overhears a few boys in front of her talking about World of Warcraft. That's the picture. As they were talking, she blurts out, "Oh, I have level 42 Hunter." And immediately, these boys turn and say, "Oh my god, what server are you on?" And suddenly, she's part of the group, right? She's talking with them about World of Warcraft, and they become friends and have, various World of Warcraft sessions thereafter. Now, she went on to college with one of these friends, and to my understanding, they're still friends today. And this is all because of a shared interest and then subsequent play sessions in World of Warcraft. So, games creating social connections. Now, this story kind of epitomizes our mission in action, right? Ultimately, we at Able Gamers know very well that a well-crafted video game can give anyone, especially a player with disabilities, a window into a different world. And when that game is combined with a decent enough internet connection, games can provide social interactions and friendships that make social isolation vanish. So this is just one example of the many types of impacts that gaming can have on players with disabilities. It goes way beyond social isolation. This is just one fairly powerful example. So hopefully this can give you some sense as to why gaming is important for people with disabilities. Now, with this in mind, I do want to talk a little bit about the size of the population of players with disabilities. This is actually a question that we get asked a lot. We frequently get asked by journalists, game developers, social media, how big is the market of players with disabilities? Now, estimating this can be difficult for a large number of reasons. Very similar to how estimating just the size of people with disabilities can be difficult. So we use the statistics that are generally available. And our best estimate is that there are 49.7 million players with disabilities in the United States alone. Now, I want to make this clear. This is players with disabilities, meaning people with disabilities who play games. This is not just the population of people with disabilities in general. This is players with disabilities. So to put that into perspective a little bit, that number, 49.7 million players with disabilities, is roughly equal to the entire combined population of the 4 states that you see here, which are Oregon, California, Louisiana, and Idaho. It's also roughly the same as the combined population of these 7 states, which are Nevada, Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. It's also roughly the same as the combined population of all of these states down the middle of the United States. So that is Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. That's a lot of people, right? Now, continuing to put that in perspective, this 49.7 million players with disabilities in the US is the same as the entire population of Canada plus 11 million people. Now that's just in the US. Well, what about elsewhere? So what about the EU? Well, again, very difficult to estimate. Our best estimate is 47 million players with disabilities in the European Union. And again, that's players with disabilities, not just people with disabilities. So once again, putting that into perspective, that 47 million players with disabilities is roughly the same as the entire population of the country of Spain. It's also about the same as the combined population of these 6 countries, which are the Netherlands, Bulgaria, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Estonia, or the combined population of these 9 countries, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, Cyprus, Croatia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Slovenia, or the entire population of Canada plus 8.6 million people. And just to make it clear, we at Able Gamers actually love Canada. Our vice president, Dr. Christopher Power, is from Canada, which is why we like to joke about Canada quite a bit. The point is, that's a lot of players with disabilities. Ultimately, there are about 100 million players with disabilities in just the US and the EU combined, and that's not taking into account the enormous number of players with disabilities around the world. That means that there are a lot of players who need accessible experiences with games. Despite that number, though, there are a lot of misconceptions about creating those accessible experiences. Misconceptions that might negatively impact whether or not game studios and developers focus on putting accessibility into their game. The thing is, though, players with disabilities, as research shows, are basically the same as all other players. So players with disabilities, they like all kinds of games. They play a variety of games, including AAA games, as well as indie games, as well as multiplayer games, online games, offline games, single-player games, you name it, they play it. On top of that, players with disabilities play together. They don't just play alone, contrary to, unfortunately, a popular belief. They play with other players, frequently with their non-disabled peers, although, of course, also with other players with disabilities. And they play both locally and online. They're also very, very passionate gamers. In some cases, more passionate because this is their outlet. But the point is, very passionate gamers who seek experiences through digital games. Ultimately, the same as everybody. The real key, though, and the thing that might make them a little bit different, comes down to these experiences, the experiences that they seek. It is important to note that often players with disabilities cannot have the same experiences in a game due to aspects of the game design locking them out. So maybe the controls don't work for them. Maybe they physically cannot use the controls. Maybe there's something in the challenges that their disability makes more difficult or potentially impossible for them. The idea is that these same experiences can't always be had by players with disabilities. And that's why it's a big part of my job to help game developers understand that and help them to enable play for everybody from the start. So how do we help game developers enable play in their games? Well, we help them to see that game accessibility is about finding and removing accessibility barriers in games. Ultimately, games are about player experience. So when a player encounters a barrier in a game that they literally can't overcome due to a disability, that experience gets pretty bad pretty quickly. Now, as developers find and remove barriers in their games, they will ultimately lead to accessible player experiences, experiences that are accessible to everybody. And again, since player experiences are literally what games are all about, that means that accessible player experiences are literally game accessibility. That's what this is all about. Game accessibility is all about creating those experiences that can be accessible for everybody. Now, even going through all of that, even talking about how players with disabilities are really the same as everybody, how important game playing can be to players with disabilities, there are still various things that developers might get hung up on when we talk about game accessibility. Specifically, there are a number of very high-profile misconceptions about game accessibility, about adding accessibility to your game. So first, and something that we hear a lot, isn't accessibility expensive? Well, frankly, no, it doesn't have to be. As long as developers consider accessibility from the start, accessibility doesn't need to be that much more expensive than anything else. And if you think about it, this is true with literally anything, right? So imagine you're moving into a house, you want to get the walls painted, you move all your furniture in, then ask the painter to paint the walls. Okay, so you're having the painter paint things at the end after everything is moved in. Okay, well, they got to come in, they got to move all the furniture out, then paint the walls, then move all the furniture back in. That's going to be way more expensive because you're paying them to do two things at once, right? And it's probably not going to be as good because maybe the furniture won't be set up the same way it was originally. That's the same thing here. Accessibility, if it's tacked onto the end, will both be more expensive and probably won't feel as integrated into the main game. Now that leads us to the next question. Won't accessibility make our games more generic? Well, once again, the answer is no, if developers approach accessibility from a design mindset. So, ultimately, accessibility is not about rigidly following a preset series of rules. The approach that Able Gamers espouses treats accessibility as a core part of design. and allows developers to maintain their creative freedom even as they find and solve accessibility barriers throughout development. Now, this leads us to number 3. Will accessibility impact our vision? And once again, no, as long as developers implement accessibility in their way. So ultimately, it comes down to developers designing accessibility into their game the same way they design everything else. So accessibility is being incorporated in their way, in a way that fits their game. And in that way, the vision is not impacted. Now, these 3 answers of why accessibility is not going to impact a game in any negative way do tend to go against the traditional way of handling accessibility in games. These misconceptions are in place for a reason, after all. There have been many developers who have implemented accessibility in potentially not the best way, and thus their game has been negatively impacted. So, in short, easier said than done. So how is it that AbleGamers allows developers to implement accessibility in their own way? Well, that leads us to accessible player experiences, or as we call it, APX. APX is a method for game accessibility created by AbleGamers that uses design patterns. These design patterns essentially act as lenses through which game developers can easily see potential accessibility barriers during the design phase and really any point of development in the game, and then they can implement accessibility solutions that come from the game's creative team. This allows game developers to consider and address accessibility the exact same way they do any other design problem that arises, using their own creativity. Now, APX informs most of the work that AbleGamers does with game developers. In fact, one of the central parts of my role at AbleGamers is helping developers to effectively use APX, either through the APX training courses that I run or in various other ways. Now, it's important to note that APX is different than the traditional ways of approaching game accessibility. Most of that traditional way comes from guidelines. Guidelines are important, guidelines are useful, they are a strong tool in creating accessible game design, but they're often not very useful during the development phase. So how does APX differ from guidelines? Well, there's a few key things that APX does that guidelines don't do. So to really lay that out, let me explain what guidelines are. So first and foremost, guidelines are rules. Things that you can do, things that you can't do, right? So basically it's saying, do this, don't do that. Now there's some very good rules typically found in guidelines, things that may be considered best practices, but it can also be somewhat stifling to the creativity of developers. In fact, there's been quite a bit of pushback from developers against guidelines for this reason. The guidelines seem to be saying you need to make your game this way and only this way, which, as you might expect, doesn't work very well and can lead to games being more generic or potentially impacting a developer's vision. Guidelines also don't typically give a reason why something is being done. Now, if a reason is given, developers can often find better solutions to the problems than maybe even the guidelines present. Right? They can find a solution to this accessibility problem that might fit their game in a better way to help preserve their vision, help keep their game from being more generic. And last, guidelines do tend to work best after a game is done, at the end. This is the cross-check, right? You're going to see how is it that we've implemented this accessibility and how does it work compared to the guidelines? Did we do things in a way that kind of work with those best practices and maybe tweak accordingly after the fact? But it's not implementing it in the moment, because guidelines can be very, very difficult to use to find problems during design and development. So what about APX? Well, APX is a little bit different because we use design patterns. To show how an APX design pattern works, I'm going to use an example, and specifically, I'm going to choose a pattern that talks about text. Why? Well, because text is such a crucial part of most games, appearing throughout games in many different forms, and one aspect of this, captions for dialogue, is a somewhat more commonly implemented accessibility feature. So, what does APX have to say about text? Well, the APX pattern that most specifically talks about text is our clear text pattern. Now, all APX patterns follow the exact same format. First, it starts with a fun symbol. In this case, it's a little a connected to a big A. Developers are going to remember that symbol and associate it with the pattern, and that's important, as we will discuss later. It also has a catchy or memorable name, clear text. It's short, it's snappy, more likely someone is going to remember it. These two things together are the starting point, and hypothetically can help people start to brainstorm things. But it goes way further than that, because APX also, every design pattern will give the developers the design problem. So the design problem for clear text is that players cannot reliably read the text in the game or its interfaces. Now you can see right off the bat, this is talking about in the game as well as its interfaces. So as well as menus and captions, what about the rest of the text in the game itself, in the game world or otherwise? Where does APX go from there? Where every design pattern has with it, in addition to the symbol, the catchy name, and the problem, it lists a series of design drivers. Now, what these drivers are there a series of examples for where this problem might arise. They're not all inclusive. They're just a few examples to help developers see where the problem might exist. So the design drivers for clear text, players with low vision may need to make text larger or increase the contrast of text in order to make it readable. Players with color vision deficiencies may need to change the foreground and background color of text to ensure it is readable. Players with learning disabilities, such as dyslexia, may prefer a different font for text in the game. For example, serif versus sans serif, which just means a little tail on the font or no tail on the font. Players may prefer to have increased contrast or size in a text. Again, these are examples, they're not all-encompassing. Now, in addition, every APX pattern has a design solution. Now, contrasted to guidelines, our design solution isn't a you definitely need to do this thing. Instead, it's a general broad category within which the solution to any given barrier will likely fall. So the design solution for clear text is players can change the way text is presented to them in the game or its interfaces so that it can be read reliably. Now, it's important to note that clear text is just one of many, many, many patterns that we have. As a matter of fact, there are 22 design patterns in all. And these patterns are split between two broad categories. We have access patterns, which is all about the player giving info to the game and getting info back from the game. And then we have challenge patterns, which is all about the actual gameplay itself. All of these are made available on handy cards that developers can use during a game's development if they wish. The info is also freely available online if developers cannot or do not wish to use the cards. Also, in sticking with the idea of keeping things memorable, the pattern types, access versus challenge, are also color-coded. So access patterns have a blue backdrop, challenge patterns have an orange backdrop. This further helps developers to more easily find a pattern that might help in a given circumstance. But how does this all work together? Well, ultimately, these all come together to form what we call the APX triangle. This starts with having access at the base. As noted, access is all about players giving info to the game and getting info back out. We call this the player feedback loop. So the players giving information to the game in the form of inputs. That game then interprets the inputs as controls of the game. The game is then presenting information to the player in a visual, audio, or haptic channel, which is then output via a screen, speaker, vibration on a controller, etc. This is a constant exchange of information going back and forth at all times between the player and the game in an ongoing loop, hence why we call it the player feedback loop. Now, as you can imagine, if the player can't input things into a game and cannot take in the information coming back out of the game, it will literally be impossible for them to play the game. As such, access is the foundation of all accessibility, and it's the bottom of our APX triangle. And we have 12 design patterns that specifically deal with access. Now, on top of that, we have challenge. Challenge is all about players making progress in the game. It's the actual gameplay itself. Now, Challenge is still important because if a player can't overcome a given challenge due to an accessibility barrier, they're not going to be able to progress in the game, and they're not realistically going to be able to play the game past a certain point. They're not going to have the same experience. Now, there are 10 patterns that deal with challenge specifically. Both access and challenge then come together, and when they are all addressed, that's when a player's experience does become accessible, and the player is able to get out of a game the experience that the developer wants them to have or that the player wants to have in that game. So ultimately, the peak of our triangle is where access and challenge come together to create accessible player experiences, or APX. Ultimately, APX is a pattern language. All 22 patterns work together to form a shorthand for a way of finding, discussing, and ultimately solving accessibility barriers throughout a game's development. Now, I want to give you two quick examples, one access pattern and one challenge pattern, just so you can see how APX can apply during the design phase. So to start, we're going to look at access. Now, once again, our access patterns are all about the input information that the player is giving to the game and the output information the player is getting back from the game. Without these, the player literally can't even start to play a game, let alone continue to play it. Clear text, which we just discussed, is one of these access patterns. But again, there are 12 of these in total. So let's take a look at one other access pattern. Specifically, I want to talk about second channel. So second channel has its own fun little symbol of different ways that information can be presented. So audio, vibration on a controller, display on a screen, etc., all coming together in this symbol. And this is a particularly important access pattern. Now, the design problem for second channel is that players are unable or unreliably able to take in information from the game or its interfaces via a particular modality and cannot rely on it solely for information. Now, when we talk about channels, it's important to kind of define what a channel is first. So what is a channel? Well, largely a channel relates to human senses. So sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell, these are all different channels through which we get information. There's a few others as well. For example, proprioception. If you've never heard of proprioception, that is the body's innate way of understanding where it and its parts are in 3D space related to other things. That's proprioception. Now, games largely use sight and hearing as their two main channels that they convey information with, right? So the video aspect of video games, that's sight. And of course, audio is crucial to any game experience, usually. So sight and hearing. Now, games also frequently use touch as a way of indicating information. So haptic feedback, which is vibration on a controller, that's one example of a game using touch. There's also some subtle use of proprioception in various games. So, for example, the way that you move your finger from one button to the next, that is all about you knowing where that button is in relation to where your finger is right now. Now, that is rare that developers directly impact the proprioception in a game, but useful to know anyway. The point with second channel, though, is ensuring that no information is presented only through one channel. So if something is presented through a visual, make sure it has an audio component that goes with it. If something is presented through audio, make sure it has a visual component that goes with it. And of course, you can also work in vibration and other channels. So to really drive this home and give you a further example, let's imagine that we're working on a classic action RPG type game. So the player controlling a character that battles enemies, gains experience points, and when they have enough experience, they level up to become stronger in various ways. So we're working on this, and someone on the development team, a concept artist, comes up to us and says, look at this cool visual that we've designed for when a player levels up. It's this really cool thing where we have a flashy ring of light that goes around the player, giving them a clear visual indication that they just leveled up. Well, that's cool, but at that moment, you as the development team can say, well, we have a second channel problem. If someone has a visual disability that makes it difficult for them to take in that visual, whether they just can't see the visuals at all, or that ring of light might blend in with the background, or there might be other ways where this visual might be difficult as a way for them to take in information, well, we should add in other ways. So let's add in a bit of audio. So maybe a unique music cue that plays when a player levels up, or a distinct sound effect that only plays when a player levels up, that's going to give an additional channel of information. And maybe we go further and we add a unique vibration pattern on the controller. So when the player levels up, there's a specific series of pulses, specific vibrations that happen on the controller that don't happen at any other time. They only happen when you level up. These are now 3 different channels that are giving the same information. This is ultimately what second channel is all about. And it's important to note that this complex discussion about, oh, well, a player maybe can't see that visual, so we need to add in an audio, and the audio can be this, and maybe we need a vibration. This very complex accessibility discussion, we can just have in 6 words. We have a second channel problem. This is the power of APX, and this really ties into what I was saying about APX being a pattern language. The more a development team uses it, the more they can use the shorthand to find and solve accessibility barriers. Now, once again, second channel is just one of our 12 access patterns. And we have access patterns that run the gamut of player input. So both from controls to presentation that the game is giving back. And again, the key is that if access is not solved, the player can't actually play your game, thus they have a bad experience or possibly no experience with your game. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we have our challenge patterns. Challenge patterns are 10 patterns that specifically deal with gameplay. Now, these are the 10 patterns here, and once again, I just want to talk about one of them. Now, challenge patterns do tend to be a little bit more controversial when we get to game developers because this is all about changing the gameplay. And as we noted earlier with some of those misconceptions, well, there might be a thought that changing the gameplay might impact the vision that a developer has for their game. But it doesn't have to. To give an example of that, I want to bring up one specific pattern called helping hand. Now, the helping hand pattern, which you can see here, has a nice symbol of a human hand reaching out to a robot hand. And the reason for this is that helping hand, the design problem here, is that players cannot progress through the challenges presented by the game without assistance from the game itself. So that robot hand, that's the game itself helping out the player. Now, this ultimately comes down to a number of different things. Any way that a player can implement some way that the game is helping the player. This could be built right into the game through some aspect of universal design, but a more common way and potentially a way that might be more useful is adding in different options that might change some aspect of the gameplay. So let me give you an example there. This game that we're seeing here is a game called Celeste. Celeste is a brutally challenging platforming game. And by platforming game, I mean running, jumping on platforms, over obstacles, jumping over, on, and around enemies, all to try and reach a goal at the end of a level. That's a broad definition of what a platforming game is. Now, in the clip that's being shown here, we see the main character of Celeste, who's a young woman named Madeline. She is jumping onto walls, briefly climbing walls. She is dashing in midair while she's jumping to get over spikes, which are obstacles that will kill her if she touches them, and precisely landing on other platforms to collect, in this scene, a key in order to open a door to continue. Now, what's being shown here is actually an early segment of the game. It's one of the very starting screens, starting levels that a player will encounter. The game actually gets a lot more complex as it progresses, and far more challenging. This is challenging on its own. It gets even more challenging. Later levels become way more difficult. They have many more obstacles, including pits that Madeline can fall in due to imprecise jumps, enemies that chase Madeline, small parts of a level that change how jumps behave when you pass through them in the level, and many additional items that you either have to or can collect as you go through. The one thing that makes this game so difficult, though, more so than most other platforming games, is that precise timing is required throughout. So it's not just timing in terms of landing in the right place, but also timing in terms of when to use your midair dash. And the idea is that you can only use your midair dash once. Once you use it, it only recharges once you land, or by grabbing certain items that are floating in midair. So you need to time your jump so that A, as you're falling, you dash the right way to get to the right place, and where you're dashing, so that you dash up or to the right or diagonally upright to get to that platform or to get through that item that will recharge your dash. And there are many, many, many levels that require you to do multiple dashes to get through the level. So you have to time your dash to hit into that recharge in midair to then dash again. And that second dash, once again, needs to be timed and angled correctly to either hit another recharge or land on a platform. Again, very complicated. Now, what helps make this game less complicated is that there is an assist mode that you can enable in the game. So what does assist mode do? Well, it can change the game speed so the entire game can run slower. This is actually not exactly an example of the helping hand pattern. This is more of the slow it down challenge pattern, but it's a very similar category. There's a lot of overlap. Infinite stamina, what that allows you to do is so when you're grabbing onto a wall, you don't fall, because that's another aspect of challenge I didn't mention. You can grab onto a wall to either climb up or down slightly to change your starting point of the jump, or just to take a little bit of time to plan your next jump. Well, you have stamina, so you can't hold on to the wall more than a couple of seconds before you start sliding down and then just fall, and you will ultimately be falling to your doom. So you can turn on infinite stamina through the assist mode. There's a whole section for air dashes. Well, what does that do? That allows you to change the number of dashes you have in midair. By default, you get one air dash, as I noted, and you have to recharge that in midair by hitting items. Well, if that's difficult for you, maybe you can add one more air dash, just to make your midair experience a little more manageable. You can in fact change this so it goes all the way up to an infinite number of air dashes. You could also turn on invincibility, so when you hit a spike, nothing happens. When you hit one of these enemies, nothing happens. You'll just land, refill your dash, and allow yourself to jump and dash some more. One thing that is not shown here is that the assist mode also turns on the ability to skip levels in its entirety. That is actually a form of bypass, which is another challenge pattern. The point to all of this is that it allows players to change things. Now, doesn't this change the experience of the game? Doesn't this impact the developer's vision? Well, not necessarily, because before you ever turn on assist mode, a player is presented with a disclaimer. You literally cannot get into its assist mode until you see and click through the disclaimer. Now, I want to walk you through the disclaimer in full, because it's actually fairly detailed. The first thing that pops up is assist mode allows you to modify the game's rules to reduce its difficulty. This includes options such as slowing the game speed, granting yourself invincibility or infinite stamina, or skipping chapters entirely. So you can see this as a player and be like, oh yeah, that's not what I'm looking for. That's not for me. I'm not going to do assist mode. I'll cancel out and just play the main game. Or you can see that and be like, great, that's exactly what I'm looking for. I'm going to click to continue. As soon as you click to continue, a second disclaimer pops up. This second disclaimer says, Celeste was designed to be a challenging but accessible game. We believe that its difficulty is essential to the experience. We recommend playing without assist mode for your first time. So what they're saying is that, well, we designed this in a specific way. Turning on assist mode and using some of the options changes it from what we had. So please try it without assist mode first. Now, you might read that and be like, oh, okay, I'm going to try it without assist mode first, see how it really is. Or you might read that and be like, well, I know I'm going to need these options because I've had so many problems with other platforming games that maybe aren't quite as challenging. So, okay, I'm going to click, all right, click OK, confirm, and continue. When you do, you're presented with a third disclaimer. And this disclaimer really is the best part of it, because what it says is, however, we understand that every player is different. If Celeste is inaccessible to you due to its difficulty, we hope that assist mode will allow you to still enjoy it. Now, what's so awesome about this third disclaimer is that there is no judging, no mocking. It's not like some other games where even just turning on like an easy mode might mock you. So for example, the newer Wolfenstein games, when you turn on easy mode, it's not called easy mode, it's called Daddy Can I Play, and it compares the player to a baby, which if you need those easy mode kind of options because you're disabled, that's kind of insulting, right? You need to play on easy because you're disabled, so that makes you a baby. That's not right. The point is, this disclaimer acknowledges that every player might need something a little bit different to play the game. And I want to read you a quote from Celeste's designer, Maddie Thorson, which really sums this up really well. It sums up the entire 3-step disclaimer very well. So here's the quote from her. Quote, "From my perspective as the game's designer, assist mode breaks the game. I spent many hours fine-tuning the difficulty of Celeste so that it's easy for me to feel precious about my designs. But ultimately, we want to empower the player and give them a good experience, and sometimes that means letting go." Everything that she said in there is represented in full in this series of disclaimers. Here are the options. They changed the game from my intention, but I recognize you may need them in order to play the game. The key to all of this is stated right in that third disclaimer. Every player is different. A game's intended experience does not need to be compromised by designing for accessibility. Instead, just by recognizing that every player is different, you realize that players might need different settings to have the same experience as everybody else. It is also worth noting that because every player is different, the whole idea of difficulty modes is usually not enough. I don't have a problem with difficulty modes. If a developer wants to put in a difficulty mode, that's fine. But ultimately, difficulty modes are nothing more than prepackaged settings that change the way the game works behind the scenes. They're chosen by the developer, and by their nature, they can't apply to every single player because, again, every player is different. So it might still end up being too difficult or impossible to play with some players due to disabilities. So you can have difficulty modes, but make sure that you give players those options specifically. Allow them to tweak those options so that they can adjust it for themselves. And that ultimately leads us right back to APX, which is all about empowering developers to find where these barriers might exist, where they might need to add in additional options so that players can tweak things to their own needs to get the experiences that they want or that the developer wants for them. Now, as noted earlier, APX informs most of the work that AbleGamers does with developers. As I mentioned, we run intensive APX certification classes. They run about 16 hours over multiple days, and they train game developers in all of the APX patterns in full, thoroughly. Now, we also do evaluation services for developers where we examine games at various stages of development. And all of those evaluations use APX as a lens through which we find different accessibility barriers. Now, we have additional services as well. So we have player panels. Our player panels are literally a group of volunteer players with disabilities who have asked and requested to work with us so that they can then work with game developers to test games and otherwise give their input on how games are working from an accessibility standpoint. And of course, AbleGamers does a lot more work beyond that directly with players, like giving them controllers, helping them set up games for settings that they need, helping them find games, etc., etc. The point is, ultimately, game accessibility is a multi-pronged approach. If you want to learn more about this, you can go to our website. So ablegamers.org is our main website where you can learn more about the AbleGamers mission and the work we do in general. Accessible.games is our professional-facing site that's really for developers to use to try and get those services that we noted earlier. If you are more interested in APX, though, Accessible.games has a full section on APX that includes all of the patterns and information on all of them, freely accessible right there online. If you had more questions from me, you're always welcome to reach out to me. My email is stevenweitz, that's STEVENWEITZ, @ablegamers.org. You can also follow me on Twitter, although I rarely tweet, but you can if you want to. That's STEVEN_WEITZ. And I thank you very much for coming to my presentation. Feel free to reach out if you have any more questions, and I hope that everybody will work towards making the gaming world a more accessible place.
AliCamp 2022.